Just so delighted to be invited to chair this today, to be in discussion with Peter about this remarkable book that's been, I feel I've been on the journey with Peter, like in the sense of I haven't had to do any of the hard work or any kind of creative genius of it at all, but I've been in conversation with him sort of throughout it, and it's been such an honour and a privilege to be a kind of interlocutor or kind of just a friend, because writers need friends, and so I feel very honoured to have been a friend for Peter just throughout the development and writing of this quite remarkable book. Peter, I think most of you know Peter, but if you don't, so he's an honorary associate at our in our department. He's a former associate professor of media in MCCALL, and is kind of, like astonishingly talented, writes traditional scholarship, writes novels, writes nonfiction, draws, is a musician, curates exhibitions. He's a historian and archivist. So he's sort of one of those, frustratingly talented people who can kind of, lend a hand to so many different areas, and just produces beautiful work in all these different sort of genres. And what's kind of beautiful about this book is that he's bringing several of them together at once, and it's unique. I don't think there's another book that's been written like this. And I think the critics and the award judges are feeling the same way. So it's just been nominated for Age Book of the Year. It received an extraordinary review in Sydney Review of Books by Bruce Johnson, a beautifully written, very erudite, insightful review. So check that out. It's a beautiful take on Peter's book, I think, and I think the reviewer really gets it, like really, really gets what Peter's project was. Anyway, that's enough from me. I just wanted to ask Peter initially, here is this finished product that is just doing, wonders in the world. How did it first develop as a project? So how did it first develop? What was practically involved? And just tell us a little bit about the research process.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. And just before I go, yes, and I would like to acknowledge your great support and fellow travellership on the long process of writing this book. I consulted with Kate often about it and received the best guidance any writer could get from Kate. So thank you again, Kate, for that. It started out as was just a vague idea of two different coalescing, research pathways. One, which was just looking at forensic photography at the big collection down at the Justice and Police Museum in Sydney. And that was, like I was doing that 20 years ago, and I had to look past, among the vast repository of photos there, the 1950s and 60s photos, which there's the bulk of the collection is of those, just small negatives, to find the stuff I was then more interested in, which was pre-war forensic records of Sydney, the 20s and 30s. And I got quite, sucked into, drawn down that rabbit hole. But that 50s and 60s photographic record was in my consciousness, mainly as something sort of very ugly and depressing and sort of familiar in a not nice way. Thousands of photographs of empty streets and lounge rooms and crappy kitchens and bare sort of joyless looking interior spaces. So that was there, but with the success of the first of the books, projects about the 1920s photographs, it seemed a natural thing to progress to work through that collection into the more recent parts of it. But at the same time, also, came across and was aware that my uncle, my late uncle, who just died around that time, kept quite a few papers chaotically and randomly, and that he was a player. And when I was a contract curator at the Justice and Police Museum, his name bore some weight down there because the curators at the Sydney Living Museums, as it then was, or Historic Houses Trust, were very aware of him in his career. He, not that he was necessarily particularly a household name now, but he was a figure in post-war Sydney. So, there were two sort of interests, or sort of things, shapes in the distant landscape, if you like, that I approached slowly and with misgivings and without the sort of, looking at the 1920s negatives, which I found. I mean, that is hard work and it's slow, and most police negatives are very boring, but still it was like there were discoveries all the time of the mugshots and extraordinary street views and photographs which seemed to have, just as in formalistic sort of terms, very strong image qualities and extraordinary contrast and composition and subject matter. So that was a desire project, but this 50s and 60s stuff was more like, oh shit, I've got to do it sooner or later. I can't really ignore it. But there were barriers there. So it was kind of very slow looking at it and just doing the research into the uncle's materials, the chaotic papers, quite a few photos, and the photos down at the police museum. It was a rather joyless process a lot of the time. And I think when for me, when I'm working on these things, the kind of curiosity and drive and joy, apart from the grind and the deadening work that any research project is, but there's got to be enough of a thread of joy and desire there. Somehow you hope that ends up in the final product, and that's really what your readers are going to feel, I hope. So that wasn't really present so much in this work, and I've worked on it a long time. There was a preliminary exhibition back over 10 years ago now called Suburban Noir, where I first addressed that material and just tried to get some sort of themes together. And it was always too big and too small and too ugly or too rich. And I, all the way through it, felt I was not really doing justice to it. Sorry, long-winded answer there, but I still don't quite, it's never quite been a thing I could just hold in my hand in a way, and it still isn't.
Yeah. So, I mean, this leads really easily to the next question, which is, how did you decide which cases to focus on? Because from my understanding of your research, and I'm about to, make a fool of myself as I try to explain back to you what I understand is your research process, which is like there might be a series of photographs of a crime scene about a crime that occurred, and there might be very, very little written documentation that accompanies that. And then you go down to state records and you start to look at the coroner's case files, any newspaper reports. Is that how you start to flesh out the details of the case? Is that the process?
Yes, very much so, Kate. Actually, it's, I guess we're all used to, I mean, all research is, there is this vagueness and this lostness about it at some stage. You've got the mess of stuff and the mess of thoughts, and they might be ideas you can develop, or they might be dead ends and you just don't know yet, but you've got to kind of entertain them all. And you sort of think you might have a central thesis, but maybe you don't, or maybe you lose that faith in that halfway through. So that was trebly, quadruply true of this. I never quite knew what I was doing. So the process in the end, by default, was just keep looking and just keep thinking about it. And, as we all know, there are so many times when you do a day's field work and you go, there's two very common things that happen. One of them is you come away from it going, well, that was wasted time. That's a day I'll never get back. And somehow, often when I speak to you on the phone the next day, I find there was one little bit to relate. Oh, there was this weird thing. And you go, oh shit, there was a thing, because I'm telling it now. So there's that sensation that at the time it was just wasted. I've just lost the other thought I had there. Sorry, I had something to add to that to finish answering your question, but I guess it was really what I was saying was it was very, very. There was not a thesis to be established or a proposition to be contested or worried, or was. And even the sort of scale of what I was looking at, whether the near and the far, the wide and the narrow, it was like is this my 50s and 60s, my childhood memories? Because it's so triggering of anybody who was alive at that time. And subsequently, I mean, Sydney and interiors look the way they did in the 50s, right? You know, lots of places look that way now. Or was it about formal qualities of photographs and police documents and police writing? Was it about the cases? Was it about social relations that the crimes and accidents sort of explicated inadvertently? So I was always, I could never really fix on a kind of methodology, even, if you like, or a process. So yeah, back to the answer I first gave, it was just looking and seeing what was left after I'd looked for a while and thought about it for a while, and then trying to.
Yeah, no, what I was going to say, what's remarkable about all your work, certainly with the photo books that you've done in the past, Crooks Like Us and City of Shadows, but then this one, which is now a different thing altogether, and it's its own thing. One of the things that's been extraordinary throughout, I think, your research and writing process is your refusal to slip into any tropes about crime. So, you know, Peter and I have a running joke where we go, let me guess, was that case about, you know, bad things happen to good people? Like all the different tropes that you find in true crime stuff. And that, you know, that you, of course, that was one of the things that you were doing all the time, was resisting those incredibly banal kind of reductionist sort of ways to be understanding what it is that you had in front of you. So, of course, if it wasn't bad things happen to good people, or, you know, whatever it was, then what was it? And, you know, and this was part of, I think, your journey to try to, it's a bit earlier when you said that with that curating that exhibition, you were trying to start to find themes, like you were trying to find some kind of organizing reason to tell it at all. And I feel like that's been the question all the way through your research, is that you kept asking yourself, why am I telling this? Like, what good, you know, that thing that you and I talk about all the time, where we go, when you're writing nonfiction, you've got to ask yourself, is it true? Does it help? And you were fine on the is it true thing, but the question of does it help? And that was the thing that you kept asking yourself all the time, which leads me to the next question, which has to do with how did you go about writing about very well-known cases? Because you've got a couple of them in the book. And how did that differ from writing about all those cases that were not known, you know, all the poisonings, all the different crazy ways people died, you know? And yeah, so can you tell us a bit about what that experience was like?
Yeah, well, the famous ones, that was, and, you know, your question's pertinent, Kate, because it was a completely different way of approaching them. And it's with the famous cases which have been written about over the, you know, there were two very famous ones, the kidnap and murder of Graeme Thorne, the 11-year-old schoolboy in 1960, and just before that, the forgotten largely now, but remembered by anybody who was alive at the time, the series of very, very awful attacks on women and children in the southern suburbs of Sydney, the so-called Kingsgrove Slasher case. So they're the ones that have been pretty famous, and the uncle had some quite original, you know, he was involved closely on both those cases, and they sort of made him a celebrity cop. So, you know, in a way, half the story you're telling is the history of the history. You know, it's like I was weaving the literature review in to the telling there, if you like, and the literature at the time, you know, was when Murdoch really got his start on both those cases. Actually, it said that the young-ish Murdoch bought the Daily Mirror in 1959 after observing how active, I mean, Bridget might be able to add to this, but correct me on it. But my understanding is he saw how well the Kingsgrove Slasher case played in the press, and it really alerted him to the importance of crime. And then straight after he bought the Mirror, the Graeme Thorne kidnapping happened, and he just poured resources into it. So there's story making at the time, and there were books at the time. There's been books ever since, right up to, you know, Mark Tedeschi, now he'd be Casey, I suppose, book about it, which strangely enough, I just mentioned this, and Mark's, you know, an associate. He's been very supportive, and I acknowledge and and appreciate his help. But I think his book about the Kingsgrove Slasher that came out a few years ago replayed one of the most basic and enduring tropes of Australian true crime. And it started way back in the early 20th century when newspapers started running series with the tagline, Crimes That Shocked Australia. And if you go back to the Horwitz and the publications of the 50s and 60s, it was a really common thing. Every time you put out a true crime book, it would be 10 crimes that shocked Australia or 50 crimes that shocked Australia. And even Mark Tedeschi, venerable public prosecutor, when his book on his book on Thorne came out, the tagline on the front was the crime that shocked Australia. So, but in a way, I pay respect. I don't mind trashy true crime. It's highbrow true crime that I really take issue with. But yeah, so you're telling the history of the story of the story. So that was one part about it. And, the more I, if the lens is as much on the telling at the time as it is on this sort of notion of pure event and phenomena that is somehow can be transmuted into text truthfully and, without static and without distortion. Doesn't happen, we know, but that is the kind of premise to all that telling. If you dispense with that, then you're always as much regarding the tellings of it, the cops, the witnesses, reporters. So, and that gives me anyway, a very strong sensibility of the sense of the variability and the arbitrariness of our sort of an anti-historicist view, that historicist idea, the Whig history idea, that things are getting better and by God, we were unenlightened in the past, but thank God now we know about gender, we know about race, we know about sexuality, and we're blah-de-blah-de-blah. There's some sense of presentism, I guess, that is as much a trap as anything else. So when you're kind of doing that long-term, the story and the stories about the story and the stories about the stories about the story, in a way, it's a preventative from feeling any smugness about the present position. So I really tried to work that in that, that's how I see it in, 2020, 2021 and 2. In 10 years' time, all of us might be seen as hopelessly retrograde and reactionary. And so I guess is what I'm getting at is don't feel superior to the past, even when it is pretty awful. So that's what I was trying to kind of, I guess, enact.
Yeah. One of the things that's compelling in the book are the drawings. So, when, how, and why did the drawings begin? And did you want to show us a couple of the drawings? So Peter's done drawings all the way through the book of crime scenes, based on crime scene photographs. And they're he had an exhibition. It's art. He's sold the,
Yeah, well, I'll just try if I share my screen, let's see what happens. I've got my PowerPoint with a few images. I'll just abandon this if it doesn't work. Oh, there we go. Yeah, is that going to? So maybe I'll just. Are you seeing my screen there now?
Yes.
You are, okay. So it looked, there are a couple of things. At first I thought this book would be a grand picture book like a Thames and Hudson or a Steidl, one of those amazing art books that museums put out and run at a loss. Well, in the 21st century, no public institution in Australia, unless it's the Australian War Memorial, is going to publish too many really amazing, big, expensive books. So mine was not going to be that. And then, so I realised photos would be small. There were all sorts of access problems. Only to say public institutions are a lot more cautious about and a lot more, they're less enthusiastic about projects like this than they were 10 or 20 years ago, which is extraordinary. Back in 2002. It was like, yeah, let's go for it.
I'm going to interrupt just to explain
Yeah.
to the group what you mean just then. So what it is that Peter would be coming across small thumbnail, like you would be like, let's say at the Justice and Police Museum, you'll be seeing photographs, either it was glass plate negs, but then it was small low res kind of versions, and you thought you might then have access to the full res that could appear in a book, and then suddenly the institution management changes, and then suddenly everything changes. So Peter had the low res versions, but not the high res that he could then publish in a book. Yeah.
Yes, no, that's exactly right. I had just my reference copies of a lot of these images, thousands of them actually, which I'd put aside. There was another thing about it too, is that, when I originally conceived the book as image-driven, image-centric, with maybe 50,000 words of text, I just had a problem where once the cops in the 1950s started taking more pictures of scenes, when they had press cameras and they didn't have great old the huge old tripod cameras, but portable cameras, they could take a lot of photos at a crime scene. So they were a bit less precious about individual photos that they took. So as a consequence, I was finding a lot fewer of just real knockout images. And it's not about beauty, it's not about beautiful images, but nonetheless, if you want to put images on the page in a book, they've got to have all sorts of strengths. They've got to have, content-wise, composition, tonally, and everything else. And I wasn't finding a whole lot of those. Plus, it was hard to get the ones I had. So I had two. Was looking hard with new policies at Historic Houses Trust that were much more restrictive than what they had been previously. Photographs were looking difficult for the book. And then my friend and running colleague, Vanessa Berry, who illustrates her own books really beautifully. And I must say, slightly naively, her partner is an accomplished artist, but Vanessa considers her own artwork limited. And in a way, what I loved about her in Gentle and Fierce, her most recent book, the artworks, their limitations are their strength in a way. There's a sort of clarity and a humility in them even, actually. So anyway, Vanessa said, well, why don't you just do drawings? And I have drawn over the years. So I started drawing, and I've just got one of the very first ones I did was this. And it's loosely based on a black and white photograph that I had of a death in a flat in Double Bay in 1961, 62, very sad story, I thought. Just a sad story of a kind of life that went wrong for no really good reason and without anybody really enacting any particular evil. So it seemed the backstories, I don't know, seem to embody a lot of a lot of the larger feeling of this book. So anyway, I did that one and I chose some colours for it. And there was a kind of, in the vague, blurry reference photo, there was that sort of jaggedy pattern, slightly schizophrenic pattern. So I just loved choosing the colours for it and doing it with coloured pencil. And I showed it to a few friends, including Kate, and I got a strong reaction. In the end, it became the cover image on the book. And, even down to things like once the process, the whole police project is so much about visuality anyway. There was never really going to get into just textual narrative purely here. Visuality was, at first I thought it was going to be the main thing, but in the end it becomes the sort of equal partner is what I'm aiming at with the text. But then, things just catch on. So Louise Cornwell, who designed the book, she sampled colours. I think the pink from the lady's dress there, and actually that sort of mustardy yellow from the floor. She sampled that and used it to sort of colour the colour scheme on the back of the books. So once you put pen to paper, it starts other things happening, which when you have really wonderful, creative people around you, like Louise and yourself, Kate, things lead to other things. And that was really a delight about this book, that it was a mess right up until sort of the 11th hour in my head, the 59th minute of the 11th hour, it felt like. And with design and editing, it sort of finally cohered as a book. Sorry, I've gone off topic there.
I think, yeah, I mean, the drawings are extraordinary. What you've just pointed to by talking about mess is a question that I have for you, which has to do with the coming together of the project. Because I know, was it always going to be a thing? Was it always going to be a single object, a single product?
Yeah, I was never sure. And right back, I first proposed the idea back, in 2011 or 12 as a big exhibition at the Justice and Police Museum. They never took it up. It became a smaller exhibition at the Museum of Sydney. But way back then, some of the advice from knowing people at Sydney Living Museums was, you've got two things here. You've got two different things. Don't try to put them together. You've got your uncle's story. And there was a bit of obvious sort of publisher interest in that right from the start, because it's a very, whoops, sorry. All my emails are coming in this time of day. It's a very obvious true crime sort of narrative. The dowdy cop who wouldn't let go of the case. It's bullshit. I just hate that kind of cornball alibi for true crime, which even, the ABC uses for their true crime, but don't get me started on all that. So, so the uncle story was one, and just the sort of multiplicity and variegation of the forensic photographic records of Sydney in the 50s and 60s was something else. And then these sort of little kind of poignant, kind of sad, kind of awful, but very revealing small stories of crime and mishap and mayhem and accidents and foolishness and just, human folly and, and wickedness, I guess. That seemed to be something else. And then the whole kind of more meta sort of me trying to putting on my wish for, Roland Barthes, John Burgess, Susan Sontag hat, and talking about the stuff as kind of, social document or socio-cultural material history, revelation. They were all possible books. And I, right up until, a year before it was published, in moments of despair, I went, what have I been thinking? I've got 3 books. I've got to break them up and make 3 books. And I went, God, I'm not getting any younger. Do I have time for this? But luckily, New South looked at it, UNSW Press, and went, no, it's a thing. We can do this. We can make this work. And so that all-important last bit of the way happened in the last 6 months. But, up until then, I was unconvinced.
I feel like your pen on the page and the pencil, and so the actual attention that you give in the making of these drawings and how they come across, that is such an organizing feel for the book, as is the narrating eye. So the vocal quality of the speaker of the book, that, and then the drawer of the book as well, are the things that actually hold the entire thing together. And I earlier you were remarking on Mark Tedeschi's book Kidnapped, and he's done that kind of journalistic sort of very legally informed, obviously, because he's a prosecutor, journalistic take on the history of the Graeme Thorne case or whatever. Could you tell us about how you arrived at the narrating consciousness of the book? Because it's not journalism, it's not scholar, it's not memoir, it's essayist, but you're combining several different registers, but in a kind of seamless speaking voice all the way through it. And I know that was hard won, but it's so beautiful. And I just wondered if you could tell us about it.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. Yeah, in a way, the quick answer is I really don't know. It just, like, things change. You get older, and there's things that I could have said 10 years ago that feel forced, or 20 years ago feel forced or posturing now. So in a way, I've found my experience is I came to writing later in life. So if I started early, maybe things would be different, but I started late, in my 40s, really. And so you lose things, you lose sort of half techniques, or I don't know, maybe it's just the same as with everything in life. The things you could have done without a second thought years ago, you can't do now. So you've got a kind of restricted repertoire of actions. And then, that exactly that thing, is it true? Does it help? And then, is it really, really true? Or do you just like the sound of yourself saying this? And so once you start asking that question, then it rules out a whole lot more. And then, does it help? Do people need to know this? Is this, the whole process, the 10 years I was working on that book was just the 10 years when that sort of, what's the word, topos of storytelling, went into mad ascent, and everybody's talking about storytelling. And when I was teaching it, storytelling techniques, and reluctantly use that word because it's so, there are so many problems with it, as we know. And it's not just enough, what am I saying? There is a core problem that notion of storytelling sort of acknowledges in a backhanded way, and that is that we need to engage. There's something that has to happen between the writer, the text, and the consumer. And it has to be some sort of involvement, some sort of attention being held to, and all that, blah, blah, blah. And it is a little bit like what happened when we were kids, when people told us a story and we were just sucked in straight away. In a way, we're trying to get that back. But in another way, that's sort of doesn't help at all, because for all the other concerns, like, does it help? Do we have time? Is the reason for its existence valid? Have you found yet a reason for its existence? So I'm sorry, I'm talking in all sorts of confused, roundabout ways. I still haven't really kind of worked out what it's about, but something happened just when I started writing, when I ruled out all the things I couldn't do and started taking out all the things I'd written in earlier drafts that seemed a bit, unwarranted or false, or just a whiff of showing off or something. Quite a bit of it probably still there, but I removed all that I could. What you're left with is just the self, in a way. Go, okay, well, it's me. It's just me talking about it. I do happen to know this little thing I remember. And, with an editor to trim it down, well, the editor didn't actually want any of the first person stuff taken out. There's not a lot of it there, but I thought really hard about any first person bits I put in there. The other thing that happens, and the way I've been answering that question is as though I generated all this insight and method or process or, whatever, a crafty sort of skill. But, my strongest sense of sort of getting a speaking position in a text or anywhere, or for that matter, playing music in a bar, which I also do, is it's not about me being the font from which all this stuff comes. It's right from the start, it's some sort of unstated contract between the other and the self. And it's when 10 years ago, before the other had read the book, it didn't exist. And as everybody here who's working on a book now is doing, you're thinking about your reader. You're thinking about her or him right now. They're not even going to get the book, but you're already imagining their thoughts and their feelings. You're trying to sort of gameplay it already. And it's something that's given you. It's a space that's given you. I really, really feel that. And somehow I just know from the public talks I've given, I've known from teaching, I know from the writing I've done, as we all know, when we lecture, sometimes you're on fire, sometimes you're preaching, the Holy Ghost is there. And it's because the students have given it to you. The audience has given you some space and you feel great. And there's a receptivity there. But it's not just about you being, the channel. It's about some collective thing. Now, that's not, I still do the work. We all do the work and the research and the footwork. But there is it's something partly bestowed. I really, really strongly feel that. And there is just some weird thing that happens when you get to a certain age. People, I feel, are more willing to do that bestowing. It's in some ways it feels easier now than it did 10 years ago. I don't need anyway. I'll stop there.
No, but that's such a beautiful. I think that's a beautiful point for us to reach out open for questions. I've got more questions for you because I could ask questions all day. But if anyone has some questions for Peter, let's have a discussion.
Thanks, Kate. And Peter, I might suggest at this point that perhaps you stop sharing your screen. Oh, I think you've just done that. Thank you.
Helen.
Oh, sorry, I turned myself on and then I turned myself off again. I'm fascinated by your process, Peter, and the fact that you had the courage to continue to pursue this when you didn't know what it was. Where does that kind of internal fortitude come from? I'm lacking it, so I'm very interested to know.
Well, what else are you going to do? I mean, it may as well be that as anything else, and everybody who does everything, anything, and, I've got friends who are artists and musicians and writers, and the unsureness and the lack of confidence, it's universal. If it's not there, well, it is among, my circles, and the doubt's good, just so long as it doesn't completely disable one. I mean, I think the doubt and the misgivings and the self-bad feeling, universal bad feeling, whatever that quality is, got to use it, but not be stopped by it. I've never really understood writer's block. Like, just keep doing stuff, keep thinking about it. If there is a block, maybe something hasn't been thought through, or maybe a device I've been trying to make work doesn't want to work, and that's the problem. Maybe I haven't found out enough about the thing. So that sort of sustains me, I guess. I know that when the writing's bullshit, normally for me the thinking hasn't. I need to do more work, either on just the finding out, just simple research, or conceptually thinking about what I'm trying to gloss over at that point.
Is that maybe what you mean when you say it gets easier? Is that you're better at
what's
in the space of the doubt?
What I'm better at now is that being confident that when it all feels like it's gone pear-shaped and hopeless and a waste of time, to persist through that, knowing, of course you feel that way. I mean, it's like anything else in life. There are inevitably moments where you are absolutely certain, with a rock solid knowledge, that this is all, you're on a fool's errand. You backed the wrong horse. It's completely wrong. And you can see so accurately, and you can be so articulate and eloquent about what's shit about the project. I know, they go, that'll pass though, that'll pass. And maybe there'll just be enough curiosity once I'm driving out to Kingswood, out to state records again, and getting the court transcripts out, or whatever, or, the newspaper records. There's the joy of labour actually comes back. I do like the work. I just like labour, research and writing labour. So that seems to be the answer. Work makes you free.
Thanks, Peter.
Other questions?
I had one, or a comment.
Hi, Nicole.
Classic academic move, comment, not question. I just wanted to say how much I enjoyed that, and what you just said there, Peter, about the joy of labour. To me, it reveals a lot about the way the book kind of opens up. Like, I kind of it felt like a landscape of reading much more than many other books that I've read. And those little stories, the sort of pointillist kind of moments, you know, where the effort is in description, you know, and you're kind of hanging on, you're hanging on for the John Tagg moments. And then, like, I found your essays on the photography so, you know, bright, you know, in the sort of metaphorically, like the flash of those police photographers, because of the ground of the kind of descriptive the workaday stories from whence they came, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And I think that the way the book's structured to me just is beautiful in that way, because you have this kind of, I don't know, it's almost like a pilgrim's journey through these, you know, the badlands of the stories, where you're like, okay, where's he going with this? You know what I mean? And then you have these little moments of revelation. So I just wanted to say, you know, how much I enjoyed that experience. And I think that sort of observation that you've talked about around your drawings as well, the sort of replicating and the work of replicating and describing comes through so well, I think, in the book. And it's a real study for other people who are interested in writing anything, really. So thank you.
Oh, thanks, Nicole. I should hire you as a sort of blurber for hire. That was fantastic.
It's also, can I jump in? It speaks to, of course, you know, Peter, the whole thing of like, what's the book really about? And, you know, one of the things I think, I'm just going to tell everybody what I think the book's about. But I think, you know, one of the things we talked about, Peter and I talked about a bit, was what was the under thing? What was the thing? And it did have to do with this sort of thesis that crime makes place. So it's the place-makingness of crime. And so that's this, so that it was, you talking about the landscape thing, Nicole, is, it shows that the book was just such a success. Like, I think it's done what it needed to do structurally and visually.
Yeah, well, just to add to that, just back to what Nicole said also, I mean, there was a thing, you know, I move in research community sort of circles, and a lot of my friends are, you know, have higher degrees or degrees and what, but a lot of my friends, a lot of people I mix with don't. And most of them are readers, and most of them are pretty bright, I think, but they have very little appetite for what they consider to be university speak. And I want to, you know, as with everything I do, I want them to like it as much as I want. So I do have a rule of thumb that you can go all sort of my version of being theoretical or reflective, with about 90% narrative to 10% reflective. And even then you're pushing it a little bit, because some people are going to go, no, how much to do, you know. So I tried not to overdo the. In fact, I had a lot more kind of I probably went to 1585 in earlier drafts, and I took it out. So yeah.
Jo.
Yes, thank you. I'm very interested because I guess my work is around those in-between places that you seem to be touching on. And I'm interested to know what Kate just raised about the place and its presence. And I'm interested to know, because I feel, again, being of a certain age, the knowledge of the 1950s and 60s in the concrete, so to speak, in the footpaths, in the numbers of cars that ran down the street, these aspects are very authentic, which you uncover in your work. So I'm curious to ask, what's your sense of your sense as you were looking at everything and as you were engaging with that project, about the sense of place and the presences in those places? I see that you've drawn and the way you've drawn and the pictures that you've shown, that there is that sensibility. So I'm curious to know more about that. I'd like to know how you found that journey for yourself as a creative person, whether it was in writing or drawing, that sensing of presence in place.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question, and that's really spot on. That goes to the real heart of what was in my head and, you know, soul as I was doing the book. That's right what it's about. And, you know, joinery in the 1950s, what a kitchen window, you know, what people were running up in workshops, the proportions, you know, there were the way just cop photographers, average suburban blokes, the way they train their camera on a scene. There are recurring aesthetic, for want of a better word, not rules, but there are conventions being adhered to, being observed, being taken in. You know, you mentioned concrete. I mean, the way paths were made, the way people worked out their form work, you know, with bits of timber to make a concrete path to go from your front door out to the footpath. That was characteristic of the time. The moulded concrete covers that the PMG put down on phone works, somebody had to design them, you know, somebody had to make them. And in a way, one part of my earlier sort of aversion to that was that, and I tried to touch on this indirectly in the last bit of the book, where with my generation, that was everything we wanted to get away from, you know.
Yes.
And we were conscious of it. When I was 15 or 16, I used to talk to my, maybe 17 more, our friend, you know, my friends, my few good, you know, a couple of close friends about, my God, how ugly is, how awful is this world? Where it, you know, there was another thing happening, you know, in 66, you know, there was Bob Dylan and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and films and Bonnie and Clyde and stuff. There was some sense that of a massive kind of churning going on, not that we would have quite been able to articulate it, but we knew. So in a way, for me, doing this book was kind of going back, you know, going back to, and I've never really gone away because, you know, my parents lived at Maroubra. They kept on living at Maroubra, my stepmother and father. And I saw it sort of change over the years. And, you know, I've seen Sydney change over the years. And now to the point where, as I mentioned at the back of the book, I drive around those 50s brick veneer or between the wars, dark brick suburbs, California bungalows. And I go, this is really lovely. It's really beautiful. I could live in one of those houses happily.
Especially as we talk about housing problems, and you look at the old 1950s and 60s houses, for example, in North Ryde, which is where my area, and it's like, well, if everyone was building those sorts of houses, maybe more people could get housing and could afford it. But there's this constant interplay between the presence and the place. So
yeah, Ryde, North Ryde, East Ryde, West Ryde, Gladesville, they are so pertinent. They are so of that time. They're, you know, we'll probably find them all heritage listed before our time's done.
Thank you very much.
No, thanks for the question, Jo. Thanks.
Any other questions for Peter? Bridget?
Thanks, Kate. Peter, I'm not sure if this is a question or a comment. I was interested in what you had to say about the Daily Mirror in the late 1950s, and of course its acquisition by the young Rupert is kind of perfect timing in a sense for this book. And there's quite a continuation there with Keith Murdoch discovering in the early 1920s the sort of potency of crime cases, especially salacious murders ideally involving girls or women. But I was kind of thinking about suburban newspapers during the period and wondering how much you drew on them, you know, something like the St. George and Sutherland Shire Leader for the Kingsgrove Slasher, for instance. Did you find Sydney suburban newspapers of use?
That's a good question, and honestly, Bridget, I didn't quite get to them. Brian had a whole bunch of local newspapers in his private collection, anytime his own name was mentioned, he kept that paper. You know? So like any kind of newspaper record, it was rather egocentric. You know, my very shallow, superficial impression, I've got a bunch of crimes on that I've got some material culture residue of, but just can't find anything in the Fairfax or Trove records. So I've got a few on my to-do list, just to go to the regional newspapers to just see whether these things popped up there that didn't seem to have registered elsewhere. My very shallow, you know, under-researched initial answer is because most of them are weekly, they tended to be a bit behind the game. So, but we just lost Bridget. Oh, there you are. Sorry, you just moved to a different part on the gallery there. Oh. Yeah, so I haven't found them a brilliant source, but I stand to be corrected on that. Do you have any thought on that, Bridget, on whether they may be or may not be?
Yeah, look, it's a really good point you make about the frequency of the papers, because that would have meant that they weren't able to sort of chase or cover rapidly evolving cases. Yeah. But it could still be interesting at looking at what kind of local perspective and angles they were sort of putting on stories. But I was also thinking, just in relation to press coverage, I mean, such a source or resource of cultural historians, to some extent interested in gender and society, as the Women's Weekly, and the very, I think, different. I mean, if we had more time, I'd love to talk to you more about sort of gender in your book. And how you deal with issues of domestic violence. You know, Jill Matthews and Stephen Garton have both kind of written about how by the 1950s, sort of suicidally depressed housewives in suburban Australia. And as I say, if we had more time, I'd love to talk to you a bit more about that.
Yeah, just my initial, you know, very quick comment on that is, as you know, when you think these topics that are just so big and so potent and so full of affect and, you know, residue, you think they'd be everywhere. And of course, there's almost total silence in the record, isn't there? When you go there, that's the things that the Women's Day didn't say or referred to, you know, at 4 removes. You know, 4 articulations of remove, turns up in the pulp, you know, in the fiction, in the comics a little bit, in the trash media a little bit, but not much in the respectable media.
I'm going to jump in as chair. We've got to 5 o'clock, but I am going to allow, assuming has just put something in the chat, and so in 20 seconds or less, Peter, the question is, you know, you've been working on this archive for a long time. Are you planning on continuing? If not, what's the next project?
Yeah, I've been working on it. I'm working on a thing now which is sort of archivy and sort of fictitious, and I don't even know if it's a thing. But it is still sort of based on archives and everything I've been talking about. But all I've got is a genre, you know, a new genre, which is true crime fiction.
That's a lovely.
Can I say that? Publisher, you reckon?
A lovely spot to finish it. To wrap up today.
Indeed,
I love that.
I've just written it down. Thank you so much.
You can't use it, Bridget. I've copyrighted that.
You do it better than me anyway, so I wouldn't even try. Look, I'm going to draw this to a close because I promised to get you all out by 5 and it's 1 minute past. So look, congratulations to Peter on the book, and we wish it continuing success. And thank you so much, Kate, for being again the most perfect sort of interlocutor for this. So thank you all very much, and I'm going to stop the recording now. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Bridget. Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.